Okay, so I kind of promised to everyone that I wasn't going to make a video this week because I was supposed to be doing some papers for school, but I realized that 2,000-word essays weren't that hard to make, and I actually finished them today. So I'm going to be doing a video about a topic that I was actually going to present in school, but I realized that I was going to do another alternative route. But I didn't want to waste the topic because today I'm going to be talking about the relationship of Honkai Star Rail and Genshin Impact. Now, the question that everyone has been asking ever since the release of Honkai Star Rail is, what is it like for Genshin Impact to be cannibalized by Honkai Star Rail? Everyone's moving to Honkai Star Rail for some reason. Is Genshin going to die because Honkai Star Rail is better or stealing its audience? And the short answer to that is no. Genshin Impact is not going to die because of Honkai Star Rail. We can just all calm down and post our pitchforks. So today, I'm going to be talking about this from the perspective of someone that does audience research and as a Genshin content creator, because there's actually a lot of nuance to this conversation when it comes to the relationship of Genshin Impact and Honkai Star Rail. Now, if you're wondering why I'm going to be talking like this, it's because of two things. One, I don't actually have this scripted and most of it is coming straight from my memory and basically just my observations as a person that's in the YouTube. Number two is that this is usually how I talk when it comes to research topics, so if you're going to need to slow down this video, then please go right ahead. I usually have a very short attention span, so I'm going to need you guys to cope with me. Anyway, we first begin with this important question with several layers to the conversation. Number one is that we need to respect that Genshin Impact is on its kind of lower energy state. You know how in every patch there's a rotation where the hype is very, very strong for a nation in the very beginning, and then it suddenly just kind of trickles down with the more festival events that kind of come up at the end. There's no big lore drops, or there's a bit more slower expansion of the world around it because Genshin is slowly transitioning into the state of the new nations, which is perfectly fair in my opinion. And here's the thing. Honkai Star Rail was released at a time that a lot of the Genshin community was very burnt out, or at least facing that kind of null when it comes to the content patches. And that is perfectly fine. It is going to be completely natural to see a transition between the people that play Genshin into Honkai Star Rail because one, Honkai Star Rail is a new game. Number two is that Honkai Star Rail is in another vibe altogether. Sci-fi versus fantasy is not exactly apples and oranges. Yes, they're both gacha games, but the vibe of both of them are very, very different. And as someone that has played Honkai Star Rail, it is very evident with how they present their characters, their dialogue, the fact that they have cell phones. So obviously speaking, there's going to be people that transition between Genshin Impact and Honkai Star Rail. Now, the more important question when it comes to this is, where do they stay? So for the sake of this question, I kind of came up with three hypothetical groups when it comes to the Genshin and Honkai people. Number one is the people that went to Honkai Star Rail and are meaning to come back to Fontaine almost immediately. These are the people that are kind of pitter-pattering between their hyperfixation between Genshin Impact and Honkai Star Rail, and they're just kind of seeing what sticks and what doesn't. Some people eventually come back, but that doesn't completely mean that it's a one-to-one convergence. For example, I was the kind of person that kind of just went into Honkai Star Rail and just like, ooh, what's happening here? But I didn't play it as religiously as I first did with Genshin Impact. I wasn't personally incentivized to do so because I had a lot of things during April, and that's why you're not seeing any Honkai videos from me. But it's not like all players that migrate into Honkai Star Rail stay in Honkai Star Rail, because again, Honkai Star Rail is also a gacha game that follows the same trends as Genshin Impact. Albeit there are some quality of life changes that I think that a lot of players would really, really demand from Genshin Impact. So that's the first group of people, the people that went into Honkai Star Rail and then they decided that they were just going to pitter-patter between. The next group of people are the people that stayed in Honkai Star Rail and have no intention of going back to Genshin. Now here's the thing, a lot of people like to misconstrue this idea that Genshin Impact is getting stolen from by Honkai Star Rail. The thing is that if a player leaves a game and stays in that new game, has it ever occurred to you that maybe they just don't like the old game in general and would just leave in the event that it was another game besides Honkai Star Rail? Burnout in Genshin is very real, and that's a thing that's probably a fact for a lot of people. Genshin is a very tedious game. I think that the constant patches is another contributor to the amount of burnout that a person can get. Quantity does not always mean quality, and some people can feel that they're kind of pumping up too many content to the point that you're forced to do everything or else you'll be left behind. Yeah, think of that like a college homework and you're going to see why it's considered burnout. If a player is not having fun on Genshin, it is not in Honkai's best interest to not take them. If anything, it's in hoyoverse's main interest to just move one money bag from one game to another game. And when that money bag is now heavily focused on that newer game, then the money bag stays in the hoyoverse cycle, which is a very fascinating thought. So if anything, if you want to address the loss of players when it comes to Genshin Impact, you need to focus on Genshin Impact itself. It's probably like the people just want to have a better experience with another game and they're willing to try that out instead of just sticking to the old game that they feel bored of. Kind of like that, you know what I mean? Now another one is that people that stayed in Genshin Impact. Now that's the third group. A lot of people are doom posting that Genshin is dying or it's at its lowest right now, which actually, never mind, that's actually completely true. Genshin is at its lowest right now. But you know, 34 million is still $34 million, kind of like that, you know, very low. Kind of hard to feel pity for $34 million being sold for 1 month. Anyway, there are going to be players that stay behind the Genshin Impact, and that's the thing, that's an important thing to consider here. Audience intention and interest is very, very fickle. As someone that does content creation, it is very difficult to actually please the audience and keep them to stay, which is why I'm very grateful that you guys are still here. But the thing is that it's not completely fair to say that Genshin Impact is dead, especially in this current state of affairs. The best way to actually see if a piece of media is dead is to look at where it could potentially be the highest performing, but it's not. Think of this as if Fontaine was to be released and Genshin Impact's numbers were still at stagnant, that's when you should be worried. Because that means that there's something wrong with the system, and that the system is no longer working. So I suggest that if you want to talk about Genshin Impact dying, you should wait until Fontaine. Another one is that there just exists players that can balance Genshin Impact and Honkai. Honkai is not necessarily a difficult game to also put into the back burner. Most of the time, Genshin Impact is just going to come back as an alternative game for the people that went into Honkai, and Honkai is now going to have that state of stagnancy, which is perfectly fair because it is also a gacha game with the same cyclical experience as Genshin Impact. Now, the thing is that Honkai does have a bit more weekly things to do, but that doesn't mean that it's completely bottomless. So you also need to consider that maybe everyone's going into Honkai now because it's new, but people are going to eventually migrate back into Genshin slowly but surely in the event that there's something big that's happening. But all of that is going to be moot in the event that we ask an important question. Where will the whales go? I actually said this before in an important video where I said that it's the whales that primarily carry the entirety of Genshin, and the thing is that it's not completely wrong. The health of a game is not only dictated by its player base, it's also dictated by the amount of money that it makes. Genshin as a gacha game heavily relies on psychological tactics to make sure that a person will spend as much as they can. And now that those psychological tactics are being used in Honkai Star Rail, the real question is, does the audience have enough money to spend? Now, there's going to be 3 key arguments or hypotheses when it comes to this kind of thing. Number 1 is that not everyone pays. Genshin Impact and Honkai Star Rail are both free-to-play games, and it is not actually required for any kind of payment at all. You can completely finish the entire game on free-to-play, which is great. But the thing is that we are not part of this equation. We need to respect that if you are a free-to-play player in either of those games, you are not part of this equation or this discussion. For the sole reason that it's not like an MMORPG that's completely fucked in the event that the player base decides to go away. Co-op is not necessarily the name of the game when it comes to Genshin Impact, which means that your player experience will not be affected by the amount of people around you, because it is a single player game. So we free-to-players are completely out of the question here. The whales are the people that Genshin needs to consider. What if the whales start to leave Genshin Impact? Obviously, you can't start whaling for both games extensively because massive whales, like the mega whales, usually only take up less than 10% of the entirety of the player base. If not, I'll give it a generous 20. And these are the people that I'm talking about that pay for the C6, R5 kind of characters. Yeah, if you multiply them by a lot of things, they're going to make a lot of money, but at the same time, you have to consider just how expensive it is to actually run a game. So the real question that people need to look at is if the whales are going to be leaving Genshin Impact for Honkai Star Rail. Now, what's the answer to this? Absolutely nothing. There's no real question to that. Because what usually happens is that for games like this, in the event that they do find something cool for Honkai Star Rail, they're still going to play Genshin Impact, but they're not going to spend. You know what I mean? Now, statistically speaking, the translation of the whales from Genshin Impact into Honkai Star Rail is not 1-to-1. Just because you're a whale in Honkai does not mean you're a whale in Genshin, and vice versa. That's because most of the time, we're not incentivized to pay copious amount of money for games that we don't particularly like. That's just a fact in life. So my point is that if you're going to talk about the audience and the state of the player base when it comes to Genshin Impact and Honkai Star Rail, a higher player base does not immediately mean that it's immensely profitable, but statistically speaking, 3% of a really big number is a big number. A lower player base also does not mean that the game is unprofitable, because most of the time, in the event that your free-to-play to whales ratio is really big, your game's going to make the big bucks. And the thing is that most of the audiences can usually just pitter-patter between Genshin Impact and Honkai Star Rail because both games are designed to be side games instead of main games. Is Genshin Impact getting cannibalized by its own other game? No, obviously not. Honkai and Genshin are both under the crowd of MiHoYo. If anything, they're a very mutually beneficial relationship. Genshin Impact losing players to Honkai Star Rail is actually in the best interests of Hoyo. Because think about it this way, if people that played Genshin Impact quitted for another game from another company, then that means that Hoyo is at a net loss. But because they're quitting for Honkai Star Rail, that means that the money is just getting circulated back into the system. It is a very fascinating thing because most of the time when games lose interest from players, the new game that gets the players is from another company or another cycle altogether. But here, it's the same cycle. It's the facade of choice. It's so fascinating, you know what I mean? It's like that same thing that happened with Honkai Impact 3rd and Genshin Impact. While they're both very different games, in my opinion, I do think that it's kind of funny that Genshin is also probably most likely and technically funding stuff that in the event Honkai Impact 3rd has its limitations because Genshin Impact numerically is the bigger game. If you just look at the graphs and consistency of how much revenue is being generated by Genshin Impact. And now that that cycle is moving on to Honkai, it just means that everything goes back into a loop. Eternity is cyclical. We're all fucking stuck in here. Anyway, yeah, if you like Honkai Star Rail, good for you. But I don't think that Genshin is dying anytime soon. So everyone can just calm down for a little bit. And I do agree that Genshin Impact is at its lower state right now, and that the audiences are moving into Honkai because obviously there are very, very clear quality of life improvements there that could be super beneficial for Genshin Impact. I also do think there's a bit more market research that we as an audience just aren't privy to. I honestly think that they cracked the code with something, with just the amount of people that were burnt out from Genshin moving into Honkai Star Rail and then wailing on it. It is a fascinating cycle. Anyway, my name is Aster and thank you for chilling with me. That is my 10 minutes for today. I'm gonna go back to writing that essay.